My name is Elizabeth Karcher, and I am the Executive Director of the Woodrow Wilson House, a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of June Noon Zoom, the continuation of our Why Wait? From Start to Unfinished, a look back at suffrage history. I'm thrilled that the Woodrow Wilson House is hosting the Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. We started the series on site at the Wilson House in March with a talk by Karen Hill from the Centennial Suffrage Commission, and that talk was about Harriet Tubman and her role in the suffrage movement. There's a recording done by C-SPAN that can be found on YouTube. Today's talk will also be recorded by C-SPAN, and we'll send you out information on how to access content after the talk. Over the next 5 weeks, we'll have guest speakers talk about the history of the suffrage movement and relate issues of race, politics, and Wilson's role in the fight for women's right to vote. Before we talk today, I would like to give you an update on the Wilson House. Although we are currently closed to the public for tours, we are finding other ways to bring the museum to you with special exhibits outdoors and online. We've planted a victory garden on S Street, right in front of the house, and we'll be posting about the history of victory gardens online and with placards in front of the house. So if you're in the neighborhood, please stop by. We will also soon roll out a self-guided audio walking tour of Embassy Row and Kalorama. We expect these will be available very shortly. We have posted a lot of new content on our website. We have virtual tours of the museum and many pieces from our 8,000 piece collection, all online. So please go to our website and take a look. As soon as it is possible, we will reopen our doors, both for tours and as special events venue for small, intimate gatherings. So if you have a wedding or a special party and you're looking for an unparalleled venue, contact us and we will help you arrange your special day. So you ask, why a suffrage speaker series? At the Wilson House, we are committed to telling diverse stories and inclusive stories that explain the full story behind our country's history. We are interested in discourse, dialogue, and discussion, and we are interested in helping people understand controversial topics that our country faced 100 years ago. Many of these issues we still face today, such as women's rights, civil rights, and international conflict. Today's news alone highlights headlines identical to those Wilson faced a century ago: pandemic, civil unrest, and rioting. We welcome new understandings and new perspectives and new narratives. We are committed to telling a story that unites us as women, as Americans, and as citizens of the world. Woodrow Wilson was our leader at a very consequential time, and the story of women's fight for the vote is complicated. And I'm thrilled to have Kimberly Hamlin to help us understand this story. Dr. Hamlin will share her talk with us, and then we will open the floor for questions. When we open the floor, please submit your questions to Elizabeth Karcher in the chat function. Your lines will be muted, and I'll read the questions aloud for Dr. Hamlin to address. Kimberly Hamlin is a historian who writes about women, gender, science, and medicine in the United States. A recent recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, she has just completed Free Thinker: Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, which came out in March of 2020. Free Thinker tells the remarkable story of the fallen woman who reinvented herself, became one of the most sought-after speakers in the 19th century America, and then charmed her way into the Wilson White House and steered the 19th Amendment through Congress. When she died, Helen Hamilton Gardner was the highest ranking woman in federal government and a national symbol of female citizenship. Free Thinker unearths Gardner's incredible journey and centers both sex and race in women's long struggle to attain the vote. Hamilton's first book, From Eve to Evolution, Darwin, Science, and Women's Rights in Gilded Age America, which is published by the University of Chicago Press in 2014, tracks the 19th century woman who drew on evolutionary science to argue for women's rights. Hamlin has also written books about the origins of the Miss America pageant, bearded ladies, and the inception of the Girl Scouts. the history of women running for president, and the Equal Rights Amendment. She is currently involved in local and national efforts to highlight the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, and she serves as historical consultant to the Bearded Lady Project, now on view at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Hammond regularly contributes to the Washington Post's Made by History column and other popular media. She has also appeared on various public radio shows on both NPR and CBC and contributed to multiple PBS documentaries. A member of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, Hamlin lectures throughout the country. So what are they saying about free thinker? Free thinker is as vivid and arresting as its subject. That's said by Jane Kamensky, and we have suffragist Helen Hamilton Gardner is someone we need to know, and that is from Martha Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor at Johns Hopkins University. So with that, I welcome Dr. Hamlin.
Thanks again for being with us today, and I'm excited for your questions and comments at the end. Now, a question people often have right off the bat is, who is this woman on the cover? Is this Helen Hamilton Gardner? So I want to just say a quick word about the cover before we begin to show you that it is not, in fact, Helen Hamilton Gardner, but my cover is inspired by this beautiful suffrage art that the suffragists of Ohio used in much of their materials. So as many of you probably know, suffragists were brilliant strategists and public relations professionals. They did a great job of creating images and artwork and pageants, and this is just one example, and I wanted to draw on suffragists' own art in my book. So that's what the cover is modeled on, and then on the right is a picture of Helen Hamilton Gardner, who does look a little bit like the woman on the cover. She had dark hair and dark eyes, but it is not in fact her. So in case you were wondering, that is the story of the cover. Now you might also be wondering, who was Helen Hamilton Gardner? And perhaps even more so, why have I never heard of her before? Helen Hamilton Gardner was a fallen woman, meaning a woman who had sex before marriage and everyone found out about it. As a result of her scandal, she changed her name. She had been born Alice Chenoweth in Virginia. She changed her name to Helen Hamilton Gardner after her scandal, reinvented herself, and became one of the best known speakers and writers in the 19th century. Then, as a result of various other trials and tribulations, she reinvented herself once more in the early 20th century. She married a Civil War hero who we'll learn more about today, and they moved together to Washington, D.C., where Gardner's various strands of her life came together, and she became the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington, and Wilson's favorite suffragist, credited with getting the 19th Amendment through Congress. Her colleagues called her the most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. We'll learn more about how she did that today and some of the challenges she faced, as well as why we should care today and what this story means for us today in 2020. I first met Helen Hamilton Gardner in the basement of the Perry Castaneda Library at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was working on my dissertation. And I was flipping through the pages of Popular Science Monthly magazine, looking to see how women engaged with science and how science was used to frame discussions about women's rights in the 19th century. And I came across a woman who I'd never heard of before named Helen Hamilton Gardner. And she wrote to Popular Science Monthly, a very well-read popular magazine in the 19th century, to dispute the findings of this man, William Hammond. Now, William Hammond had been the Surgeon General of the Union Army during the Civil War, and he then became one of the founding members of the American Neurological Association, as well as one of its first presidents. Hammond had become very interested in brains and brain disorders after the Civil War and his work with soldiers who suffered various ailments as a result of their wartime service. And by the 1870s, 1880s, he became, we might say, obsessed with understanding what he believed to be the innate differences between male and female brains. He ultimately claimed that he had discovered that women's brains were different from and inferior to men's brains in 19 distinct ways, including weighing less, having less distinct convolutions, and thinner gray matter. Now, this struck many women as absurd, But only one woman picked up her pen and wrote Popular Science Monthly to dispute one of the top scientists in America. And that woman was Helen Hamilton Gardner. And I put, this is a copy of her first letter, and then a quote from a speech she later gave that helped make her famous in women's rights circles, to give you a sense of her charm and wit. So Gardner was speaking here about this shift from understanding gender difference in terms of religion, the Adam and Eve story, to science. And she wrote, when religious influence and dogma began to lose their terrors, when people began to question the Adam and Eve story, legal enactments were slowly modified in women's favor, and hell went out of fashion. Then conservatism, ignorance, and egotism took counsel together and called in medical science, still in its infancy, to aid in staying the march of progress. So here she was excited to greet science as an ally, only to find it used to block women's entry into public life, and in particular education. So I started to wonder, who was this bold woman who had not gone to college, who was not a physician, who nevertheless had the nerve to conduct her own scientific studies into brain science and then write Popular Science Monthly to disprove the theories of Hammond, which she in fact did. So I began following her around in the archives and just seeing what I could learn about this fascinating woman. So I looked and looked here and there for years, and then I'm going to show you the letter that I came across in the Library of Congress, which is when I knew I had to write her biography and tell her story. This is a letter that I came across in the Adelaide Johnson collection at the Library of Congress. Adelaide Johnson is known as the sculptor of suffrage. She's the sculptor who made the bust of the Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony that is now in the Capitol Rotunda after having been in the basement for 75 years. She also created, or sculpted, I should say, the busts of several women's rights leaders, including Gardner, and she has a fascinating collection at the Library of Congress. And for some reason, she has several of these letters from Gardner that were written in code. So I was searching for what felt like days through the Adelaide Johnson collection, wondering, why am I doing this? Will I ever find anything about Gardner? And I came across this handwriting, which you can see at the top. And only because I knew that it was Gardner's handwriting did I keep reading. You'll see the letter is written to Little Phil, and it's signed Little One. So nowhere did it say Helen Hamilton Gardner, but I knew this was her handwriting. And then if you can read at the top, you'll see it says, underlined, best destroy this letter. Now, believe me when I say this is like catnip to historians. There's no 19th century letters hardly that I have ever found that detail what this letter goes on to detail, which is Gardner's affair, a secret scandalous life she lived with for 25 years with a man named Charles Smart, who unbeknownst to her had a secret wife and family the entire time, how Smart died in an asylum, possibly the result of untreated syphilis, and how Gardner was now finding herself betwixt and between, to say the least, as her lover's secret wife had come back to claim his belongings. So this was, wow, what a story, I thought. So this was when I knew I have to tell the story of Helen Hamilton Gardner. So because of this coded letter, best destroy, that thankfully was not destroyed, I committed in earnest to telling this story and began following Gardner around. Here is what I learned. As I mentioned, she was born as Alice Chenoweth in 1853 to a prominent Virginia family. When I first learned this, I did not understand the significance this would play later in her life, and that it really helped her bond and connect with both Woodrow and Edith Wilson, his wife. This really helped secure their connection, their Virginia heritage. But Gardner's father, like Wilson's, was a minister, but Gardner's father also came to support the Union and the abolition of slavery. When Gardner was just one, he moved the whole family to Washington so that he could manumit the people he held in bondage, and then moved the whole family to Indiana in support of the Union. Both father and all of her brothers fought for the Union and ended up dying prematurely as a result of their Civil War wounds. Alice Chenoweth was the youngest in her family of 7. So the Civil War really disrupts her family. They lose most everything, and she has to fend for herself. So in the 19th century, if you are a middle-class white woman, basically the only respectable way to fend for yourself was to become a teacher. So young Alice Chenoweth, at the age of 19, moves to Cincinnati to go to teacher training school. She soon becomes a really renowned teacher. She gets a job in Sandusky, Ohio, and is by the age of 22, the youngest school principal in Ohio history, which is something she's so proud of. She includes it in her biographies for her whole life. But this is where her story takes a fascinating turn that really shapes the trajectory of the rest of her life, and you might even say of American history. You can see in the picture that she's also a beautiful young woman. She was barely 5 feet tall, 90 pounds, and everyone commented on her dark, lustrous eyes. So her achievements in the classroom and her good looks brought her to the attention of the Ohio Commissioner of Common Schools, a man named Charles Smart, who increasingly came to visit Sandusky. Now, this raised the eyebrows of her neighbors and of Sandusky officials who wondered, why is the state commissioner spending all this time in Sandusky? Sandusky is not the capital of Ohio. It's not the biggest city in Ohio. We don't have the best schools in Ohio. Why is this guy constantly in our town? Now, Gardner has the misfortune to be a boarder at the same house as the brother and sister-in-law of the guy who edits the local newspaper. So Gardner's comings and goings quickly make their way into the newspaper, which reports that Commissioner Smart is coming to Sandusky to visit, as you can now guess, the young school teacher. Their affair becomes news across the state. Some newspapers, like this one, the Jackson, Ohio Standard, even print her name, which again at the time was Miss Chenoweth. Now, this would be the point at which most women's lives would end. You've been outed for having an affair with a married man in papers across the state. She was fired from her job. She was run out of Sandusky. She has really no family and no money to fall back on, and she's the ripe old age of 23. So, but our heroine, Gardner, does not take this path. Instead, she takes a few years to regroup, to read widely, and the question that she really struggles with is the sexual double standard. Why is a woman's worth equated to her virginity? Why is the loss of virginity, she would later write, tantamount to the loss of her life? Why is this the most important characteristic of a woman? And why are men held to such different standards when it comes to sex? So the affair really marks a turning point in her life in terms of her reading, her thinking, and we'll soon see her activism. This was the preface to her first novel, where she wrote, "A man is valued of men for many things, least of which is his chastity. A woman is valued of men for few things, chief of which is her chastity. This double code can by no sane or reasonable person be claimed as woman-made." After she has this sort of incubation period where she's reading and thinking, she reemerges in New York City with a new name, and no one knows that this new name is connected to the old. Her new name is Helen Hamilton Gardner, and she makes her public debut on the national stage as a free thought speaker. And this is a picture of her from that same time period, and she becomes known as Ingersoll in soprano, which is an homage to the nation's most popular speaker at the time, Robert Ingersoll, who was known as the Great Agnostic. So during those years where Gardner is thinking and writing and pondering, she becomes aware of this guy, Robert Ingersoll, whose brilliant speeches and oratory draw crowds of 10,000 or more. And what Ingersoll does in his speeches is critique the Bible and to argue for the importance of living a full life here and now and not waiting for the afterlife. His catchphrase was, "The place to be happy is here. The time to be happy is now. And the way to be happy is to make others happy." And this message really resonated in the years and decades following the Civil War. So Gardner began to wonder, if Ingersoll can draw crowds of 10,000 or more, why can't I? So she took the bold step, again, another bold step of writing Ingersoll and sharing some of her writing, which looked at the biblical lessons, which she knew so well from growing up as the daughter of a minister. She took the liberty to send her writings to Ingersoll, who said, "Oh, these must be read in public." Not only that, but he supported her throughout her career. He even traveled to New York City to introduce her very first lecture at Chickering Hall in January 1884, which guaranteed her crowds and press coverage that no first-time speaker, especially not a woman speaker that nobody had ever heard of before, could imagine. So Ingersoll helps launch her on the national stage, and she soon becomes one of the best known speakers and writers in the 19th century. She ultimately publishes 7 books and countless essays. And just to give you a couple examples, this was her first book, Men, Women, and Gods, which was a collection of her first speeches, and it went into at least 13 editions. By 1893, at the World's Fair in Chicago, where millions of Americans traveled to, Gardner, again, is one of the best known women there. She gave more speeches than any other American woman, and the New York Sun reported that next to Susan B. Anthony, Helen Hamilton Gardner created the most profound sensation. She gave her speech, Sex and Brain, there, where she kind of detailed her brain research and countered the claims of William Hammond, which were still popular. She gave addresses about heredity and the sexual double standard, and one called Woman as an Annex, in which she critiqued the sort of foundational idea that she found in politics and religion and medicine and science, that man was the example and woman was an annex to him. And she said, that's not the way we need to be thinking about women. From there, she turns to fiction. And she turned to fiction because what she really wanted to talk about was sex, and in particular, the sexual double standard, which was really hard to do under the Comstock laws in nonfiction. So she turns to fiction and short stories to tell this what limited choices women have when it comes to sex. So an important part of my book is showing that the fight for bodily autonomy has always been a key part of the women's political fight, and especially the suffrage movement. These are Gardner's novels, which made plain the few choices women had when it came to sex, and in particular, the crime of grown men having sex with young girls as young as 12 or 10. For this, she became known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women, and she also found her first political cause, where she learned the lessons she would later apply to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. Now, this lesson, or this cause, was the age of sexual consent. So I want you to pause for a second and take this in, because this statistic is so shocking. In 1890, the age of sexual consent for girls was 12 or younger in 38 states. In Delaware, it was 7. Let that sink in for a second. So Gardner and many other women's activists knew this was a huge, travesty, an unspeakable crime, but only Gardner was really bold enough to write about it in her novels. Members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union had been advocating for the age of consent changes in law, and Gardner really helped amplify it at the national level. She moved to Boston to take over a magazine called The Arena, which she used for the single purpose of working to raise the age of sexual consent, ideally to 18, and if not, to 16 in every state. And again, this is where she learns the lessons that she soon applies to the 19th Amendment. She made a strange bedfellow, if you will, with members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, because Gardner was neither Christian nor did she support temperance, but these were the women working to raise the age of sexual consent. So Gardner joined hands with them. Because, as Frances Willard, the president of the WCTU, said, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink in the degradation of woman. And this age of consent campaign really showed to women, even women who were reluctant suffragists, like many of the temperance activists, that suffrage was the way to go, and even more so that women should hold office. So one quick example of this, a sort of fun fact you can take away from today's talk, is that the very first bill ever introduced by a woman state legislator had to do with raising the age of sexual consent. After Colorado enfranchised women in 1894, 3 women, including Carrie Holley, who you see here, were elected, and Carrie Holley introduced the very first bill proposed by a woman, and it was to raise the age of sexual consent to 18. So women saw a really clear link between the right to vote, hold office, and to maintain their bodily autonomy. Holley later became a suffrage leader and wrote this letter to Woodrow Wilson, which I came across in the Woodrow Wilson papers at the Library of Congress. Another link in this chain that we're focusing on today. Now, after Gardner works to raise the age of sexual consent, she goes through a whole nother series of trials and tribulations, which we can talk more about in the Q&A, and she kind of reinvents herself again when she marries this guy, Colonel Selden Day. in April of 1902. They get married in DC, and then they travel the world for 5 years, having many adventures, which you can see. These are the thousands of lantern slides she took. They're now housed at the Smithsonian Archives because she donated them there. And here's just one of her many adventures where she's riding a camel across the Egyptian desert. So again, we can talk more about this fascinating phase in her life, but ultimately she and her Civil War hero, Colonel Day, settle in Washington, D.C., and they buy this lovely house not too far from the Woodrow Wilson house at 1838 Lamont Street, right next door to, wait for it, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, James Beauchamp Champ Clark, Democrat of Missouri. And now here in the early 1910s, the various strands of Gardner's life all come together for the cause of women's suffrage. She had previously not considered herself a suffragist. She was close friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but was considered suffrage kind of too narrow of a cause. But by the 1910s, she's all in. She joins the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is known as NAWSA. And by 1912, NAWSA refers to her as their most efficient volunteer in Washington. In part, what made Gardner so efficient and helpful in DC was her husband, Colonel Selden Allen Day's address book, chock full of Civil War heroes, Confederates, and Union veterans alike, who by the 1910s were running the show in Washington along with their sons and nephews. So Gardner had a wide and diverse access to power in Washington, and also her charm. Her first main kind of victory for suffrage was to put together with Alice Paul the 1913 suffrage parade, which I'm sure you Wilson aficionados and scholars all know was such a big moment for suffrage and for Wilson, as it took place the day before the first inauguration of President Wilson. Here's Gardner alongside Alice Paul in their makeshift Washington, D.C. office. Gardner used her contacts and her charm to secure all the necessary permits, which was no small feat, for the women to walk along Pennsylvania Avenue and to have their pageants on the steps of the Treasury building. She also was press committee chair, which Alice Paul marveled at the success Gardner had in getting newspapers across the country for the first time to grant positive coverage to the suffrage movement. And here's just one picture of the many taken, and then this is from the Library of Congress collection of the thousands of women who marched and the thousands of onlookers who came to watch and ultimately disrupt this historic parade. But soon after, Gardner and Alice Paul become bitter enemies. And this really plays out over the course of the next 7 years as the 19th Amendment comes to be debated in Congress. And you can especially see this rivalry in their various approaches to President Woodrow Wilson. Even though Gardner herself had been a young firebrand, by the time she moves to DC as the wife of a revered Civil War hero, she's toned down a little, and she's very much invested in her personal charm and in working with members of Congress and elected officials of both parties. So she comes to deeply resent Alice Paul's protest tactics, and especially her heckling of President Woodrow Wilson. Gardner becomes a leader in NAWSA's Congressional committee. They call her their diplomatic corps. Alice Paul splinters off to form the National Woman's Party. Gardner returns, let me pause for a second. Gardner returns from a trip to California in the spring of 1916 to learn that Alice Paul has been heckling Woodrow Wilson. Gardner herself has not yet met the president, but she's aghast at this young firebrand's heckling of the president. So she picks up her pen and her typewriter, and she writes a letter to Wilson's chief of staff, Joseph Tumulty, and she says, "I cannot believe what I hear about these suffragists heckling the president." She says, "I want you to know that Alice Paul and her brand of suffragists do not speak for the real suffragists of America, the members of NAWSA like Gardner." She even encloses a detailed memo listing the differences between Alice Paul's group and NAWSA, emphasizing NAWSA's longstanding commitment to bipartisanship. Then she says, "Please use this memo in any way you see fit." And it was soon inserted in the Congressional record to help members of Congress distinguish between the various factions of suffragists. And even more interesting, perhaps for us today, she ends with a little PS, and she says in handwriting, "Is there ever a time when Mrs. Wilson would accept visitors? As the wife of an Army officer, it would give me pleasure to call." And the very next item in this folder is a little handwritten note that says 10:30 tomorrow. So by the very next day, Helen Hamilton Gardner, or HHG as I call her, is already inside the Woodrow Wilson White House, charming Mrs. Wilson. Over the course of the next 18 months, Gardner becomes the most favored suffragist in the Woodrow Wilson White House. She befriends Rudolph Forster, she befriends Tumulty, she befriends Mrs. Wilson. She's a welcome daily presence at the White House within months. You can even see the effects of her diplomacy within a couple of weeks when Nassau leaders sent a letter to Tumulty requesting to meet with the president. And you can see here in Wilson's own hand, are these ladies of the Congressional Union variety? That means the Alice Paul heckling variety. So this was really striking to me to see that here, 3 years into his tenure in the White House, Woodrow Wilson still does not know the difference between the suffragists. So to answer this question, Tumulty shows him Gardner's memo to say, no, these ladies are not the hecklers. So Wilson then says, as you can see, okay, Tuesday, 2 p.m. So Gardner really uses Wilson's growing antipathy to Alice Paul as a way to work her way into the White House. So as Alice Paul and her colleagues are protesting outside, Gardner charms her way inside. She uses Wilson's growing annoyance with Alice Paul as a way to charm her way in. People often talk about Alice Paul's relationship with Wilson, but from what I've seen in the Woodrow Wilson papers, to call it a relationship is sort of analogous to my relationship with George Clooney. It's imaginary and mostly one-sided, right? Alice Paul writes letters. Woodrow Wilson says no. Alice Paul says, can I come on Tuesday? Woodrow Wilson says no. And increasingly, by the end, he basically says nothing, which is when Alice Paul starts protesting. On the flip side, Gardner begins sending apricots from her garden, charming letters, effusive thank you notes. So what Alice Paul really was effective in doing was making a place for Helen Gardner. Woodrow Wilson may not have been so receptive to her overtures had it not been for Alice Paul. So over the course of 18 months, HHG cultivates this close relationship with Wilson, and she later boasts that she asked him for 22 favors to get the 19th Amendment through Congress, and he granted 21 immediately and without question. Now, the most significant favor I want to highlight just here for a minute was Wilson's help in getting the House to create a women's suffrage committee. Now, this may sound super boring. It's certainly not as sexy as protesting at the White House or getting arrested, but this is the vital procedural measure that enabled the 19th Amendment to come before Congress for a vote. The women of Nassau had wanted this House committee to be created for decades, and Gardner took it as her personal mission to make it so. She thought she could do it right after the 1913 parade, but was thwarted by Alice Paul's protests. So she eventually turns to Wilson, and she says, President Wilson, will you please tell the chair of the Rules Committee, Representative Pugh, who was not a suffrage ally, will you please tell him to let us have our committee? So Wilson does, as you can see here. He immediately writes Pugh, and then later in September of 1917, when the committee comes for a vote, this letter to Pugh is what they held up on the floor to show the president supported the creation of a House Committee on Women's Suffrage. Within months, the House votes on the 19th Amendment for the first time in January 1918 and passes it. So this is really an important step in getting the 19th Amendment through Congress, made possible by HHG's relationship with Wilson and his help in getting the 19th Amendment passed. Now, you may notice the date here. This is during World War I, and you may think, I thought the suffragists in Nassau did not advocate during World War I. That was their public position. They said, oh, we'll take a little break from really stridently pushing the federal amendment, and we'll use this time behind the scenes to create the House Committee, which they did so effectively. Here's Gardner and Carrie Chapman Catt on the steps of the White House after one of their many meetings with the president. So you can really see the vital role that Gardner's relationship with Wilson plays in the 19th Amendment's trajectory. Another important element of the 19th Amendment's trajectory through Congress, which I hope we'll talk more about during the Q&A, is the role of race. A very surprising thing I found during my research was that by the 1910s, the main objections in Congress to the 19th Amendment had nothing to do with women's capacity to vote or with women voting destroying the family, which had been sort of the 19th century objections, but instead the objections were very much expressly about extending the franchise to Black women in the South, which Southern leaders also feared would prompt the federal enforcement of the 15th Amendment, which had not been done since 1877. So just to give you one example is Gardner's correspondence with John Sharp Williams, the senator from Mississippi, who suffragists hoped they could convert to a yes. Gardner wrote him because they were close friends and said, please, John Sharp Williams, will you support our amendment? And he wrote back, this is from his papers at the Library of Congress, and he says, you know, HHG, you're a great friend. If anything could get me to vote for the amendment, it would be your letter. But I will never vote to enfranchise the Black women of Mississippi, he says, because they will almost all, without exception, go to the polls, why the white women will not. And then furthermore, he says, and this really was shocking to me, he said the real reason that the Black men of Mississippi don't go to the polls is not because of the various, you know, state-based restrictions we've passed to keep them from the polls. It's because of violence. And he says we can't really use violence against women, even if they're Black women, he says in this letter. So that really showed me the lengths to which white leaders have gone and went to keep Black citizens from the polls. And again, I hope we talk more about that because that's a really important part of the 19th Amendment's trajectory and legacy. Here is Gardner at the signing ceremony for the 19th Amendment after it passed both houses of Congress. She is in this picture because she planned the signing ceremonies, even down to purchasing the fancy gold pen that the Speaker of the House and the Vice President used to sign the amendment before sending it off to the states for ratification. Here she is with the Vice President as he signs on behalf of the Senate. After the 19th Amendment passes Congress, but before it's ratified, President Woodrow Wilson nominates Gardner, above all other women and suffragists he knew, to be a civil service commissioner, overseeing nearly 700,000 federal employees. This makes her the highest ranking woman in federal government and a national symbol of what it finally means for women to be full citizens. This is Gardner's happiest time of her life. She loves her job. She loves going to work every day. She buys a car. She keeps up her correspondence with the Wilsons. And this is really, I think, her best time. But she has an eye always to memory. This is a picture of the gold pen she purchased for the signing ceremony, and which she soon, within days, sent along to the Smithsonian as she began urging the Smithsonian to create the first ever suffrage exhibit, which they did. Although it was very small and not to Gardner's specifications, but it just shows she's thinking always about memory. How will the story of women's rights be told? How will the story of women's contributions to democracy be remembered? And here's the slide I'll end on today because it speaks to Gardner, her kind of zest for life, and her desire to change our narrative, to change the story of America, and to put women more centrally in it. This is a picture of Gardner on one of her two beloved ponies, her Andalusian horses that she brought back from Puerto Rico that she used to ride all around DC. And here she is posing in front of the Thomas statue, a Thomas circle. And I think what she's saying is, where's my statue? When will we build statues and memorials and monuments to women? When will we name things after women? How will the story of the suffrage movement be remembered? So that's the question I want to end with and that I hope we will pick up with in our discussions. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you very, very much. We have some questions that have come in. My first would be to ask, Kimberly, can you either go closer to your microphone or use the computer microphone? Because sometimes you're going in and out. And
Sure.
So you have some way that the sound is steady.
Sure.
That would be appreciated. Terrific. Thank you. The first question is, she had these extramarital affairs or sex before marriage. Did that result in any offspring? That was the first question that came out to everyone. So.
That's a great question. Is this better for the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Gardner just had one affair, and it was with the school commissioner from Ohio, Charles Smart. And after their affair, they lived together for 25 years and said that they were husband and wife. That's sort of the great secret of her life. It was only when he died that she learned he had had another wife the whole entire time. And she managed to keep this scandal under wraps for her whole life. So no one until now has known this. And she did not have any children that I know of.
We have another question. That's great. Thank you. Another question is, The Woman's Hour is a great book and also explores racial issues of the time. So did everyone know about HHG's previous life when she changed her name? And if so, why did she bother changing her name?
That's a great question. She always said that she changed her name when she began writing and publishing her radical views, her free thought views, and her sex reform views. She didn't want to be associated with, or didn't want to cause shame to the sort of first family of Virginia, the Chenoweths, into which she was born. So that's maybe a little bit true, but I think she really didn't want to call attention to the published reports of her affair back in Ohio. And her chosen name, Helen Hamilton Gardner, interestingly, I think was her way of signaling her fidelity to her lover, Charles Smart, because Hamilton and Gardner were his maternal and paternal grandmother's maiden names. So she couldn't take the name Mrs. Charles Smart because that was already another woman's name. So she took the names of his grandmothers.
Another question from Judith. How did they overcome the resistance to Black women's right to vote?
That's another great question. And, I wouldn't say that suffragists overcame resistance to Black women voting. I would say they capitulated to fears about Black women voting. So, as I mentioned, the main concern for members of Congress of both parties and from all regions was enfranchising Black women in the South, and or the related fear that the 19th Amendment would cause the 15th to be enforced. So rather than say, like, of course, African-American women should be allowed to vote, white women suffrage leaders said instead, keep disfranchising Black women in the South the exact same way that you do Black men. They basically said, we don't care about the 15th Amendment, keep your state-based discriminatory laws that limit the franchise in a variety of nefarious ways, and we won't say a word, just let us have the 19th Amendment. And you can see that during congressional negotiations, and you can see that after the 19th Amendment is ratified, when Black leaders like Mary Church Terrell approach Carrie Chapman Catt, approach Maude Wood Park, president of the League of Women Voters, approach Alice Paul, and they say, and Mary Church Terrell and others said, gosh, it's great, the 19th Amendment has been ratified, but Black women in the South still can't vote because of all these state-based discriminatory laws. Can you help us get the 15th and 19th Amendments enforced in the South? And the League of Women Voters and the National Women's Party basically ignored these requests and refused to work together to make it so that Black women in the South and other women of color could vote.
That's fascinating. We have another question that comes in from Michelle, and it says, was there any coordination with suffragists in the UK? I know that Alice Paul got her founding and her roots in learning from the women in the UK and their movement. Tell us a little bit if HHG had anything to do with that and learned from the UK's lessons.
Yes, so Alice Paul is the best known example of that. Also, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her children, Harriet Staten Blatch, had a lot of correspondence back and forth with the British suffragists. So the HHG example is almost a more negative one because it was in England that Alice Paul learned about protest tactics, learned about taking it to the streets, learned about lobbying against political parties, and those were the lessons she brought home to the United States in the early 1910s, and those were the lessons that Helen Hamilton Gardner really disavowed and did not support. So I have no records that Helen Hamilton Gardner worked with or corresponded with the British suffragists, but she certainly did not like the lessons that Alice Paul learned from them.
Did, and this is another question that came in, can you explain her relationship with, for instance, with the Black suffrage leaders? Do we know anything about her relationship with the Black women who were leading the fight?
So is no correspondence that I have found between Gardner and the Black women suffragists, and this is pretty typical of white suffragists. They did not tend to work closely with Black women suffragists. Mary Church Terrell, for example, would occasionally be allowed to speak at Nassau, annual meetings, but Nassau leaders did not usually heed what she said. And also Nassau, and even more so the NWP, were effectively segregated. Nassau let local chapters make their own membership rules, which basically meant that white women could exclude women of color. So to look for the activities and accomplishments of Black women suffragists, we really have to expand the suffrage archive beyond the mainstream white-led suffrage organizations, which tended to be discriminatory against Black women. One element that I didn't mention in my talk today, but that I discuss a lot in my book, is the role of race and racism in the 1913 suffrage parade. So one thing that is often talked about is that it was segregated and how that came to be. So Helen Hamilton Gardner, as Alice Paul's right-hand woman, was one of the women, and it was along with other DC suffragists, who told Alice Paul that it would be not go over well in DC, which she described as a southern city, especially after the 1912 election, when Woodrow Wilson became the first Southerner elected president since the Civil War, and when both houses of Congress were controlled by Democrats. The DC women told Alice Paul, we can't have an integrated parade like they occasionally did in the North. They said DC is a southern city. So that is a negative aspect of Gardner's legacy. And also in the suffrage archives, you can see the back and forth about whether or not Black women would be allowed to march and how. And the members, the leaders, the executive committee of Nassau very explicitly told Alice Paul to let Black women march and not discriminate against them, but that is a message that Alice Paul didn't really heed. There's tons of messages from Black women suffragists, including even a sorority group from Howard University, who wrote to Alice Paul to say, hey, we want to march, where do we sign up? And Alice Paul basically cold shoulders them. She doesn't really write back and say you can't march. She just doesn't write back at all.
For those of you online who plan to attend the other talks during this series, we have the author of, it's Rebecca Boggs Roberts, and she wrote the book about the March on Washington in 1913, 1914. And so she will explain about what happened at that march and how that came to be. Right. So I've got some other questions. So why, if we know that Edith Wilson was not in favor of the suffrage movement, but we also know that Edith and HHD became friends. And so tell us a little bit about that relationship.
I think at first, Edith Wilson was just happy that someone wanted to visit with her. From what I could tell, the first few months of her tenure in the White House maybe were a little lonely, as people thought perhaps President Wilson had remarried too quickly. So I think at first she was glad that someone wanted to come visit with her. And I think they also bonded over their Virginia heritage. And more specifically, they had a shared status of kind of Virginia first families who had lost their money and lost their fortunes. They had that in common. And they were both kind of spunky. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Edith Wilson was the first woman in DC to drive a car.
Yes, she was.
So I think they had that kind of shared spunkiness that they liked about each other. Another thing that they bonded over was their shared love, platonic in the case of HHG, but of Woodrow Wilson, and their shared commitment to his legacy. You can really see that in the post-presidency years when HHG continues a relationship and a correspondence with both Woodrow and Edith Wilson. So I think Edith Wilson really appreciated that HHG, loved President Wilson and thought he was a great leader and wrote him, effusive letters and thank you notes. So even though they didn't see eye to eye on the vote, they had much else in common.
Excellent. Yes, Edith was a remarkable, as you could say, a spunky ball of fire. She did have she was the woman who had a driver's license in Washington, D.C. It is on exhibit actually at the Presidential Library, but I think we can get some photos for people to see. It's remarkable that she did not know how to ride a bicycle, but she did know how to ride a car. Woodrow Wilson needed to teach her how to ride a bicycle in the halls of the White House. And of course, she taught him how to drive. He never actually learned how to drive, but she did learn how to ride a bicycle. So was HHG active in any way in the 1916 election?
I guess I would, not really. So she, in 1916, that was when she was really kind of gearing up in her role on the Nassau Congressional Committee. She attended the Republican National Convention in Chicago that year, which actually, I think thousands of Nassau members and suffragists did. They staged elaborate parades there, including one that involved an actual elephant. And HHG was really influential that year in convincing in part Woodrow Wilson to address the Nassau Annual Convention in Atlantic City that September, and then also to move, or to open, I should say, a Nassau headquarters in Washington, D.C. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was then the president of Nassau, refused to move the actual headquarters. She wanted it to be in New York City where she lived, but HHG sent her a really detailed 9-page memo saying why it was so important, she thought, for Nassau to have a big presence in DC, which previously they didn't. So Nassau opened what they called Suffrage House at 1626 Rhode Island, a beautiful, beautiful mansion. And they had, it was suffragists lived there. They had parties there. It was staffed 24/7. And Gardner thought that was really important, in large part to counter the voice of Alice Paul in Washington, because she said a lot of reporters came to seek the view of suffragists and only found Alice Paul. So Nassau needed to have a presence in DC. So those were her kind of focal points in 1916, the party conventions, the Nassau Convention, and the opening of a Nassau office in DC.
It's amazing. Another question that's come in is, so you said that there were a number of favors that she asked of President Wilson, but that one was not granted. So what was the favor that she asked for that wasn't granted?
So in the fall of 1918, as President Wilson is beginning to turn his attention to negotiating the end of World War I, Gardner sent him a very moving letter describing why she thought he should appoint Carrie Chapman Catt to the International Peace Commission negotiating the end of World War I. And she says basically, women have given all for this war. Women have, in some cases, give their sons and their husbands. We need a stake at the bargaining table. We need a voice in the peace treaty. And Woodrow Wilson said no. He wrote back and he said, basically, as much as I personally might like to appoint a woman, and Carrie Chapman Catt, of course, not only was an international suffrage leader, she was also an international peace leader. So she really would have been a wonderful person to appoint. But Wilson said that the other parties involved, the other nations, would not see fit to negotiate with a woman. And then actually Gardner wrote him back a really kind of snappy reply. That's the first time she ever spoke harshly to him, was she wrote back and said that his refusal took courage out of her heart.
That's a pretty bold thing to say to the president.
Yes. Oh, and speaking of bold things, one thing I didn't mention, throughout the course from 1916 to the Congressional passage in 1919, she got increasingly bold with President Wilson, including even sending him bulleted to-do lists. In that. So, yes.
Well, I like that she started her career with science and believing that a woman's brain was equal to the size and weight and depth and density as a man's.
Yes.
So whatever became of her brain?
That's a great question. So first, she convinced her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to donate her brain to science. This was a kind of a big 19th century thing to do, because Gardner had found in her research that scientists pitted the brains of educated men, the leading scientists and doctors, against the brains of women that they found on the streets or who died alone in hospitals. So she said, even if there are differences between male and female brains, we need to at least, compare apples to apples. So she convinces Elizabeth Cady Stanton to donate her brain. But then when Stanton dies in 1902, her children say, no way. There's no way our mom's brain is going to Cornell, which had the biggest brain collection. So as Gardner's preparing her will, she consulted 2 different lawyers. She named the specific doctor at Walter Reed Hospital who would take her brain out. And she even wrote the president of Cornell to make sure that her brain would go to Cornell's Burt Wilder Brain Collection and I'll show you a picture where it remains on display today, jarred in formaldehyde. There it is. And then you can also see, can you see that, the brain of Stanton's
No,
brain?
you've got to share your screen.
Oh, it didn't work?
Yeah, if you could share your screen and show us that picture.
Oh shoot, I hit share screen. Let me try again.
Oh, there we go. We see your screen.
Does that work? Oh, sorry, great.
We see your screen, but we don't see, oh, we see the slide before that. One slide before.
There's the brain.
There you go.
And there's Stanton's brain bequest form showing that Stanton did intend her brain to go. And there's HHG's brain, where it lives outside the psychology department at Cornell. And then next to it is her grave at Arlington National Cemetery, where she is buried with her husband, Colonel Day.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks.
It's an amazing story. It's really a fascinating story. I have to say, what I'm most pleased about this story is that we have a lot of people who come to the Wilson House and they say, oh, Wilson was against the suffrage. He was really not for the women. And the reality is he actually was for it. He was historically, and what I really appreciate about your research is that you went to the Wilson papers. There are hundreds of letters and documents. We have the volumes at the Wilson House. And what I really appreciate is that you went through the Wilson papers to do the research on what his true stance was and how he evolved during his presidency to allow the women and bring it to make it possible, I should say, for the amendment to be brought and have it passed. So I appreciate your hard work and your research on that. And I think the book was great. And I really enjoyed your talk, and all the questions were phenomenal. With that, we're at the top of the hour. I just want to remind everybody that the Suffrage Speaker Series will be taking place for every Tuesday at noon in June on Zoom. So please tune in next week. Our speaker will be Angela Dodson. She is going to be talking about her book, Remember the Ladies, Celebrating Those Who Fought for Freedom at the Ballot Box. So we'll see you all next week. We'll send out some information on links. I know there have been some questions about things about the Wilson House and how to sign up. We will send that out to all of you after this talk. So if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Elizabeth Karcher, Executive Director at the Woodrow Wilson House, and have a great week and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.